On a stormy night in Kansas, a lonely old man heard a strange noise outside. When he stepped onto his porch, he saw about 50 Hells Angels with their motorcycles and 3 big box trucks parked in front of his house. They asked to take shelter for the night, explaining that the storm was too dangerous and that the secret goods they were transporting couldn't get wet. Although he didn't want to host them, especially with the suspicious cargo they carried, he reluctantly let them stay in his barn and secretly called the police. What he didn't know was that when the officers arrived the next morning, a shocking truth would be revealed, one that he would deeply regret. Morning came slow over the Kansas plains, turning the frost on the fence posts silver. The wind was low but constant, whispering through the empty cornstalks left from harvest. Tom Smith stepped off his porch with the same steady rhythm he'd kept for 40 years, boots creaking, hands in the pockets of his old brown coat. He stopped by the mailbox, tugged it open, and frowned at the stack inside. More bills, more warnings printed in red ink. He carried them back to the kitchen table, where a single cup and plate waited from breakfast. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. The house still smelled faintly of Ruth's lavender soap, even though she'd been gone 2 years now. He touched the rim of her favorite mug before sitting down. "Still paying off things we don't need anymore," he murmured. Outside, the hens clucked in their pen, impatient for feed. Tom sighed, pushed away the letters, and pulled on his gloves. He fed the birds, checked the water pump, and wiped his nose against the cold. Overhead, the sky was a hard blue-gray, the kind that promised bad weather before nightfall. He paused at the edge of the porch, gazing out toward the horizon where the land flattened into miles of winter wheat stubble. The silence of Kansas could be gentle or heavy. Today it was the latter. "Ruth, I'm trying," he thought. "I'm just tired of trying alone." By late afternoon, the radio started crackling with alerts. "Tornado watch for Ellis County until midnight," said a calm, clipped voice. "Residents should prepare to shelter." Tom looked out the window. The color of the sky had turned eerie, greenish, almost metallic. He'd lived long enough to know that color wasn't a good sign. He filled the generator with fuel, made sure the cellar latch was working, and set out bottled water and a flashlight. Then he sat at the kitchen table again, waiting for the first rumble of thunder. It came just after 8. The wind picked up, branches scraped the siding like fingers. He heard something else too, the distant growl of engines. At first he thought it was a truck on the highway, but the sound multiplied, low, rolling, rhythmic. He stepped onto the porch and squinted through the rain. Headlights, many of them, snaked down the gravel road toward his farm. A long line of motorcycles followed by 3 big box trucks, 50 bikes, maybe more. The engines throbbed like thunder over the wind. They slowed near his gate. One figure at the front signaled with his arm, and the convoy turned into his driveway. Tires crunched on wet gravel. The leader, broad-shouldered, leather jacket gleaming with rain, swung off his bike and walked toward the porch. "Evenin', sir," the man called over the storm. "Name's Roy Collins. We're riding through from Colorado. Weather caught us. Any chance we could shelter in your barn till this thing passes?" Tom gripped the porch posts, studying them. They looked rough, black leather, patches, tattoos. Hell's Angels stitched in red across more than one back. Not the sort of crowd you saw asking politely on a farm lane. "The barn's solid," Roy added, raising his voice over the wind. "We've got some temperature-sensitive cargo that can't get wet. We'll be gone by first light." Tom hesitated. The rain stung his face, the wind bent the trees sideways. He could say no. He could tell them to move on. But the way Roy spoke, steady, respectful, made him pause. He nodded. "All right, but just the barn, you hear?" "Understood," Roy said, and waved his arm. The riders moved with surprising order. They guided the trucks toward the big metal barn and began unloading crates, heavy and neatly stacked. They covered them with thick tarps, checking the ropes twice, working as if they'd done this many times. Tom stood near the doorway, watching. Lightning flashed across the fields. Rain hammered the roof. The smell of oil, wet leather and gasoline filled the air. "What's in the boxes?" Tom asked. "Temperature-sensitive goods," Roy said. "Can't talk specifics. Promise we'll leave no trace." Tom frowned. The men were polite enough, but secretive. One young rider nodded to him on his way past, rain dripping from his beard. Another carried a small heater inside and set it near the crates. They seemed protective, almost careful. He told himself not to get involved, but curiosity itched at him. Sensitive goods, he muttered, watching them post 2 men by the barn doors like guards. He went back to the house and shut the door. The storm grew worse, thunder rattled the windows. He stood by the phone on the wall staring at it for a long moment. Finally he lifted the receiver. "Sheriff's office," came a woman's voice. "This is Tom Smith, out on County 9. Got a convoy of bikers on my land. They say they're storing cargo in my barn. You might want to swing by at dawn, check it out. We'll send a unit in the morning, Mr. Smith," she said. He hung up and leaned against the counter, ashamed of the small relief that washed through him. Ruth would have told me to trust folks, he thought. But Ruth ain't here. The storm roared on. He couldn't sleep, so he sat near the window watching flashes of light split the dark sky. Around midnight he saw movement through the rain, riders hurrying to reinforce the barn doors, dragging tarps tighter, shouting to one another over the wind. Against his better judgment, Tom threw on his coat and went out. The gusts hit hard, pushing him sideways. A rider saw him and waved. "Need a hand, sir? Just making sure my barn doesn't blow apart," Tom shouted back. The man grinned, teeth white against the rain. "We'll keep her standing." Another rider handed Tom a pair of work gloves. "They'll save your fingers." Tom stared down. They were heavy leather, worn but sturdy. He pulled them on and helped hold a hinge while Roy hammered it back into place. "Good gloves," Roy said over the wind. "They belong to my wife's daddy," Tom replied. "Still doing the job." They worked like that for an hour, side by side. When the worst gusts passed, the riders tied down the last tarp and checked the crates again. Their movements were quick, efficient, almost gentle with whatever was inside. Back in the house, Tom peeled off the wet gloves and laid them by the stove. He felt uneasy. Something about these men didn't fit the picture he'd built in his head. They were too organized, too quiet, too respectful. Still, he'd made the call. The deputies would come at dawn. Nothing to do now but wait. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the kitchen window, watching the barn lights flicker through sheets of rain. The sound of engines idling low was oddly comforting. It reminded him of Ruth humming in the kitchen late at night, a rhythm that said everything was under control. He smiled faintly. Then the smile faded. "Maybe I judged too fast," he thought. "Or maybe I'm just lonely enough to see the good where there isn't any." The hours crawled by. The storm's fury slowly broke apart into scattered rain and wind. By 5 in the morning, the sky was a dull gray, heavy with leftover clouds. The land looked scrubbed clean and tired. Tom stepped outside, his boots sinking into mud. The riders were already breaking camp, folding tarps, securing ropes. Steam rose from the barn roof. One man coaxed a stubborn generator to start, laughter rising when it finally caught. Tom hesitated, then poured coffee into a thermos, walked it over, and held it out. "Black," he said. Roy accepted it with a grateful nod. "Bless you for that, sir." Tom almost smiled. "Storm treat you all right. Could have been worse. One truck's tires soft, but we'll make it." Just then the sound of sirens cut through the morning air. 2 police cruisers rolling fast down the county road, lights flashing red and blue across the wet fields. Roy's men turned toward the sound. Tom's stomach tightened. The patrol cars swung into the drive, crunching through puddles. "Morning," called the first officer, stepping out. "We had a report of suspicious vehicles." "That'd be me," Tom said quietly. Roy looked at him but said nothing. "Mind if we take a look?" the officer asked. Roy held out his hands, palms open. "We've got nothing to hide, officer. But please be careful with the cargo. It's delicate." A younger cop frowned. "Delicate? Huh? What are we talking about? Chemicals? Drugs?" "Not even close," Roy said evenly. The tension thickened. Some riders shifted uneasily, others crossed their arms but stayed calm. Tom could feel the air crackling again, not from thunder this time, but misunderstanding. He cleared his throat. "Maybe I should." "Step aside, sir," the younger cop interrupted. "We'll handle it." They moved toward the barn. Roy followed, still composed. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and fuel. The officers eyed the stacked crates, their flashlights sweeping over the tarps. One reached for a lock. "Please," Roy said, "let me explain." "No explanations," the officer muttered. Before Tom could speak, his eye caught a small crumpled paper near the door, muddy, pressed under a boot print. He bent down and pulled it free. It was a letter, written in purple crayon, on hospital stationery. He brushed away dirt and began to read. "Dear Santa, I don't need anything for me this year. Could you bring toys for the other kids in the hospital, especially the ones in the cancer ward? I think they need it more. The men on the motorcycles said they help you. I think that's really nice. Love, Sophie, age 7. Tom's throat went dry. He looked up at Roy, then at the crates. "What's this?" the older officer asked. Roy nodded toward the letter. "That's one of ours. Fell out of the donation bag, I guess." Tom's voice cracked. "You're delivering toys?" Roy smiled faintly. "Riders for Hope, been doing it 20 years. We bring Christmas gifts to kids' hospitals every December. The storm caught us on the way." Tom swallowed hard. The younger officer froze, shame creeping up his neck. "Go ahead," Roy said softly. "Open one." They lifted the lid from the nearest crate. Inside were rows of brightly colored boxes, dolls, puzzles, soft toys, some medical-friendly devices in sealed plastic. A faint scent of new rubber and cardboard rose in the cold air. No drugs, no weapons, just gifts. Tom's stomach twisted. "God help me, I called the law on Santa's helpers." He looked at the officers. "They're telling the truth. Let him go." The senior officer cleared his throat, embarrassed. "Sorry for the trouble, folks. We'll be on our way." When the cruisers finally rolled off down the road, Tom stood there, hat in hand. The riders were quiet, packing up the last crate. "I'm sorry," he said to Roy. "I didn't know. I shouldn't have." Roy put a hand on his shoulder. "You protected your home. No hard feelings." Tom tried to speak, but his throat felt tight. "We've got a long drive," Roy said, smiling. "Next stop's Riverside Children's Hospital. Gotta make it by sunrise tomorrow." Tom nodded, watching as they started their engines. The roar filled the cold morning, shaking the wet air. One by one they rolled out of the yard, headlights cutting across the puddles. When the last truck disappeared down the road, Tom stood in the silence. The barn door creaked behind him. He went inside, picked up the letter again, and read it under the weak light bulb. Purple crayon, uneven lines, a drawing of a smiling Santa, and a little girl waving beside a motorcycle. He folded it carefully, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Ruth would have loved these people, he thought. She always said you can tell a person's heart by how they treat strangers. Outside, the wind had died down. The fields steamed faintly under the first hint of sunlight. Somewhere far off, a train horn sounded. Tom closed the barn door, and looked once more down the empty road. He whispered into the quiet, "Guess I still got a lot to learn about kindness." And with that he turned toward the house, unaware that this small mistake, the wrong call made on a stormy night, was about to change the rest of his life. The morning after the storm, Kansas looked washed clean but weary. Puddles mirrored the dull sky, and tree limbs littered the yard, like stray thoughts. Tom stood on the porch, coffee mug warming his hands, staring toward the road where the convoy had vanished hours earlier. The barn smelled faintly of oil and damp straw. Inside, a single glove one of the riders had left behind lay beside the door. He picked it up, brushed off the mud, and set it on a shelf. He could still hear the echo of their engines fading into the distance. The quiet they left behind pressed heavy on him. Maybe they're halfway to the hospital by now, he thought. Maybe they're handing out those toys already. He wished that were true. By late morning, he was repairing fence boards. The wind had snapped when a faint hum of tires reached his ears. He looked up just in time to see 2 police cruisers slowing near his gate. His stomach dropped. Deputy Harris stepped out, hat pulled low. "Morning, Mr. Smith. Everything all right out here?" Tom wiped his hands on his jeans. "Fine. They left at dawn. We saw the convoy on Route 17, Harris said. Just wanted to be sure they didn't cause trouble." Tom shook his head. "No trouble, only kindness. I just didn't see it soon enough. Harris raised an eyebrow but said nothing. After a few minutes of small talk, they left. The gravel crackled under their tires, until it disappeared into wind again. Tom went back to work, but his mind kept circling the same thought, how quick he'd been to assume the worst. Ruth's words played in his head. People surprise you most when you stop expecting much. He felt the shame of that call burn quietly behind his ribs. That night, the storm clouds cleared, leaving a hard frost that glittered under the porch light. Tom couldn't sleep. The letter from the little girl, Sophie, sat folded on the kitchen table beside his mug. He read it again and again, tracing each uneven word in purple crayon. He imagined her small hand pressing down too hard on the paper, the crayon breaking halfway through. He imagined her face when the riders arrived at her hospital, bringing the toys she'd wished for the other children. For the first time in months, his eyes stung not from wind or exhaustion, but from something softer. You were right, Ruth. I judged them by leather and noise instead of what they were doing. He went to bed still thinking of Sophie's letter. The next morning dawned crisp and pale. Tom cooked eggs and toast, left them untouched, and turned on the radio for background noise. A farm report came first, then weather, then a local news segment. Damage from last night's tornado system has been reported across western Kansas, the announcer said. A convoy of volunteer riders delivering Christmas toys was among those affected. Several trucks overturned near Miller's Creek, destroying hundreds of donated gifts. Organizers say they are still assessing losses. Tom froze. The announcer continued. Roy Collins of Riders for Hope made an on-air plea this morning, asking anyone able to contribute toys or funds to contact local stations. He said, quote, "We're running out of time. For some of these kids, this Christmas may be their last." The kitchen clock ticked loud as a hammer. Tom turned off the radio and stared out the window toward the barn. Inside that barn, the night before had been crates of toys, safe, dry and whole. Now they were splintered somewhere along the creek. He stood there a long while. Then he nodded once, like a man coming to terms with something he already knew. He started by looking around the house. What could he sell? What could he spare? Not much. The land was worth less every year, and most of the equipment was older than his grandniece. But then his gaze settled on the far end of the shed, the green curve of his father's 1952 John Deere tractor. He walked over, pulled back the tarp. The paint gleamed like wet leaves even in the dim light. He'd spent 3 winters restoring it, bolts polished, seat re-stitched, engine purring smooth as a cat. It was the last real thing he had of his father's. He ran a hand along the fender. "You've served us well, old boy." Ruth's voice came from memory, gentle as the breeze through wheat. "Varmints, storms and money, they come and go. But kindness is what sticks to a man's name, Tom." He nodded slowly. "You always had the right of it, Ruth." That evening he called Bill Henderson, the tractor collector over in Hayes. "Bill, it's Tom Smith. You still buying vintage equipment?" Bill chuckled through the line. "If it's green and older than me, I'm interested. I've got a 1952 Model 60 fully restored. Thinking about letting her go." "Tom, you serious? That tractor's a beauty. Why sell it?" Tom hesitated. "Christmas." There was a pause on the other end. Then Bill said softly, "All right, I'll bring a check and a trailer tonight." Under the glare of Henderson's shop lights, the tractor looked almost too perfect to part with. Bill circled it, whistling low. "She's worth every bit of 12 grand, he said. Tom signed the title with a firm but trembling hand. When Bill passed him the check, Tom folded it into his pocket without looking. "You sure you're okay, Tom?" Bill asked. "I'm fine, just need the money to get somewhere fast." Bill patted his shoulder. "Merry Christmas, friend." "Merry Christmas," Tom said, his throat thick. As Bill drove away towing the tractor, Tom stood in the driveway watching the taillights fade. The night felt bigger than usual. The stars above the prairie looked cold but clear. "Goodbye, Dad," he thought. "Help me make this count." He didn't sleep at all. Before dawn, he drove into town in his old pickup heater groaning. The first store he found open was a 24-hour discount mart on the highway. He filled one cart, then another dolls, trucks, puzzles, building sets, coloring books, stuffed animals. A young cashier blinked at the mountain of toys. "All this for who, sir?" she asked. Tom smiled faintly. "Kids who could use a good morning." By noon he'd hit every shop within 50 miles, filling the truck bed high enough to rope down a tarp. When the cab couldn't hold any more, he stuffed the passenger seat with small bags of wrapped candy and new socks. At each stop, people asked questions, and more than one clerk slipped in a free item. Word spread fast in small towns. Before long he wasn't the only one loading boxes into the pickup. A man from the hardware store brought out a stack of toy toolkits. A waitress from the diner next door ran out with 3 teddy bears she'd bought herself. "God bless you," she said as he thanked her. "Just passing it along," he replied. By sunset the pickup sagged low on its springs. Tom fueled up, checked the map, and turned east toward Riverside County, more than 200 miles away. The road stretched dark and empty ahead, the horizon glowing faintly orange from distant towns. Snow flurries started around midnight, small and dry, swirling in the headlights. The wipers beat a slow rhythm. He stopped once for gas and coffee. The clerk, a teenager with a Santa hat, asked where he was headed. "Children's Hospital," Tom said. "That's a long haul tonight. Worth every mile." The boy grinned. "Merry Christmas, mister." "Merry Christmas," Tom answered, and drove on. Near dawn the radio crackled again. The same voice from before, Roy Collins, was giving an update. "We're still short on toys after the wreck," Roy said. "If anyone's on the road this morning, we're gathering at Riverside Children's around 8. Every little bit helps." Tom smiled through his fatigue. "You'll have a bit more than that, Roy," he said to the windshield. He pressed the accelerator gently. The old truck hummed, steady and faithful. "Hold together, old friend," he thought. "We're almost there." As light spread across the horizon, the hospital came into view, a pale building with Christmas lights twined around its entrance. A row of motorcycles stood lined up outside, their chrome dull with road salt. A few riders sat slumped on benches, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Tom pulled in beside them. The truck door creaked as he stepped out. One of the men looked up, eyes red from lack of sleep. "Can I help you, sir?" Tom lifted the tarp from the truck bed. The toys gleamed in the weak morning light. "Thought you might need a little backup," he said. The man's jaw dropped. "Holy Roy, you gotta see this." Roy Collins came out of the loading dock, limping slightly, face drawn with fatigue. When he saw Tom, he stopped cold. "Tom Smith," he said, smiling slowly. "Didn't expect to see you again." Tom reached into his coat pocket and handed him Sophie's letter. "You left this behind." Roy looked down reading, then looked up, eyes glassy. "We lost most of our load in the creek." "I heard," Tom said. "Sold my tractor. Figured this might patch the hole." For a moment Roy said nothing, then he stepped forward and gripped Tom's shoulder. His voice broke. "You sold your father's tractor." "Seemed like the right trade," Tom replied quietly. Roy nodded, blinking hard. "You just saved Christmas for a lot of kids, Tom." Inside the hospital, warmth hit like sunlight. Nurses and volunteers hurried about, decorating a small tree, arranging what few gifts they'd salvaged. When Tom and the riders carried in the first boxes from the truck, people began to clap. "Where did all this come from?" a nurse asked. Tom smiled. "From a bunch of small towns and some good folks who still believe kids ought to have a Christmas." The riders unloaded in silence, except for the soft rustle of wrapping paper and the squeak of boots on linoleum. When the last box was carried inside, Roy turned to Tom. "We couldn't have done this without you." Tom shook his head. "Looks to me like you already did the hard part." Roy chuckled. "You gave us the finish line." Tom smiled back, but inside he felt something loosen, something that had been knotted for years. Ruth's words echoed again, clearer this time. "What we do for others is the only thing that keeps." He looked around the ward, Nurses laughing, bikers stacking boxes, children peeking from doorways. For the first time since Ruth passed, Tom felt part of something living, something that didn't end when a person was gone. When they finished unloading, Roy clapped him on the back. "You staying to see the kids get their presents? If you'll have me, wouldn't have it any other way." Tom followed them down the hall toward the pediatric wing. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and disinfectant. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling. Through the window of one room, he caught a glimpse of a little girl drawing with purple crayons. His chest tightened. That must be her. He smiled and kept walking, unaware that this Christmas morning, the one he almost ruined, was about to change everything. The pediatric wing was bright, but quiet, the kind of quiet that listens. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling on thin threads. Someone had taped cutout stars above the nurse's station, and a small electric candle flickered beside a bowl of candy canes. Tom walked beside Roy, boots muffled by linoleum, the smell of disinfectant and cinnamon mixing in the warm air. He kept one hand in his coat pocket, feeling the soft crease of Sophie's letter against his fingers, as if it were a small compass. A nurse in green scrubs greeted them. "Good morning, folks. I'm Denise, child life specialist. We can go room by room. Take your time, let the kids choose. Some are sleeping, some might not want much talking." Roy nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He looked at Tom. "Ready?" Tom took a breath and nodded back. "You asked for a chance to help. Now do it right." They started at the far end, where the windows caught the thin winter sun. In the first room, a boy with a pirate hat and a pale face watched them over the rail of his bed. Tom crouched to eye level, knees popping a little. "Morning, Captain," Tom said softly. "You calling the shots today?" The boy smiled, a tired but real smile. He pointed at a toy ship with sails the color of fresh laundry. Roy handed it over with two sailors and a tiny anchor. The boy's mother wiped her eyes, and Tom felt heat rise behind his own. In the next room, a girl with a head wrap chose a painting set. "I like purple," she whispered, as if admitting a secret. Tom pulled out a box of extra brushes. "Purple's a good color," he said. "Strong. Shows up even when the light's low." She laughed quietly, a sound like wind chimes. They moved on, taking small steps, letting each room be its own world. Roy, who looked like he could bench press a motorcycle, untwisted doll packaging with patient fingers and swapped out batteries like a jeweler repairing a watch. The riders followed behind with carts, big hands moving gently, rough faces soft with attention. Nurses drifted in and out, smiling, directing, keeping an eye on the time and the tubes and the machines. Between rooms, Tom found himself touching the letter again. "You were right to write, little one. You told the truth before I could see it." He wondered if Ruth could see him now. He hoped so. He could almost hear her voice. "Don't rush, let them lead, Tommy. You're here to serve, not to fix." Down the hall, Denise paused outside a door with a purple drawing taped to it. Clumsy stars, a big round Santa, and a motorcycle with hearts in the wheels. "That's Sophie's," she said. "She's awake." Tom swallowed. His palms were damp inside his gloves. He knocked lightly and stepped in. The room was small but cheerful, the blinds open to a gray sky. A little girl leaned back against pillows, a knit blanket to her waist. Her eyes were bright. A crayon box lay open on the tray table beside her, the purple worn to a nub. "Hi," she said, almost formal. "Are you the helpers?" "We are," Tom answered, taking off his hat. "And I brought your letter back. You dropped it at a barn that kept us dry." Her eyes grew round. "You found it?" Tom pulled the paper from his pocket and smoothed it on the tray. "I kept it safe. It guided me better than any map." She studied him with a seriousness that made him straighten his shoulders. "Do you know Santa?" Tom glanced at Roy. Roy grinned, eyes damp. "We know what he likes to see," Tom said. "Kindness, mostly." She nodded as if that made plain sense. "I didn't ask him for anything for me," she said, almost apologizing. "I saw that," Tom replied. That's how your letter changed things. Sophie looked at the boxes the riders were rolling past the door. Did the toys make it? She asked. They sure did, sweetheart, Tom said. Some got lost in the storm, but folks helped and we brought more. She smiled, small and satisfied. Good. What do you like? Tom asked. We've got a lot to pick from. She tapped her chin. I like animals. And colors. But the kids down the hall, some of them can't play long. We should pick quiet things, puzzles, soft things. Tom's throat tightened. You're thinking of others on Christmas morning, he said. That's a rare thing. Sophie's mother, who had been sitting quietly in a chair by the window, spoke up. She thinks about others all the time, she said softly. Sometimes I have to remind her to think about herself a little. Sophie shrugged, almost sheepish. Tom reached into a crate and brought out a soft white rabbit with floppy ears and a little ribbon. He's quiet, Tom said. And he listens. Sophie took the rabbit and pressed it to her chest. What's his name? That's for you to decide, Tom replied. She thought for a moment. Maybe Hush, she said. Because he's soft and you can tell him things. I like that, Tom said. Hush is a good friend. He stood to go, not wanting to tire her. Sophie touched the corner of the letter with one finger. Thank you for finding it, she said. I worried it got lost. Tom smiled. Some things don't get lost easy, he said. They wait until we're ready to see them. Back in the hall, he leaned his shoulder against the wall and took a breath. Roy handed him a paper cup of water. You all right? Roy asked. Yeah, Tom said. He shook his head. She's 7. Roy nodded, looking down the hall. Reminds me why we ride, he said. They kept moving. A boy named Carter chose a toolkit and asked Tom to show him how a wrench worked. A teenager in a hoodie, thin as a willow switch, took a pair of headphones and a sketchbook and looked at Tom as if he were being handed a rope across a river. Tom said, You draw what the day looks like to you, and the boy nodded and hid a smile. Then they came to a room where the blinds were half closed. Machines hummed a steady rhythm. A small boy lay still, eyes heavy with the kind of tired that sleep cannot lift. A nurse checked the monitor and gave them a gentle nod. Marcus, she whispered. We've got friends here. His eyelids fluttered. Tom stepped close, slow and quiet, and set a small music box on the tray. It was a simple thing with a crank and a tiny train in a glass ball that circled a snowy village when the tune played. Let's see what this does, Tom murmured. He turned the handle. A soft melody rose, clean and bright. The train began its patient circle. A tiny figure on the platform lifted a hand, frozen in greeting. Marcus's mouth twitched at the corners. Just a hint, then a little more. The slightest smile, like a shy sun trying the edge of a cloud. There it is, Tom whispered. The nurse put a hand over her heart. Been a rough couple of days, she said quietly. You gave him something sweet to hold on to. Tom swallowed hard and kept the crank turning, slow and steady, as if speed might break the spell. Worth more than anything I ever owned, he thought. And the thought did not feel like a sentence he'd made up. It felt like the simple truth. At mid-morning, someone brought cinnamon rolls from the cafeteria and a pot of coffee that struck Tom as the very scent of relief. They stood at the nurse's station for a moment, catching breath. Through the glass the sky had changed to a soft, forgiving blue. Roy pulled a small envelope from his jacket and held it out. We took up a collection last night, he said. After the creek, folks sent money by phone too. It's not what you got for the tractor, but it's something. For you. Tom stared at the envelope, heavy with bills. He could feel the weight of it from where he stood. His mind did a quick trader's math. Heating oil due in 2 weeks, seed money for spring. The roof on the south side a little wavy. He closed his hand around the paper cup instead. Use it for gas and food, he said. You've got miles to ride. Tom, Roy said gently. You made a sacrifice. You don't have to be a hero about everything. Tom shook his head. The air around them seemed to sharpen into focus. He remembered the way the tractor had looked under the shed light, bright as a promise he had already kept. He remembered his father's big hand guiding the steering wheel when he was a boy. Ruth's laugh when the old engine finally turned over like it was young again. All of it slid into place behind a newer picture. Marcus's smile. Sophie hugging a rabbit named Hush. I did what I should have done, Tom said. voice even. Let's not undo it now. Roy studied him for a long second, then nodded and tucked the envelope away. All right, he said softly. All right. A quiet came over Tom. Not empty but settled. It felt like the click of a latch when a door closes right. He hadn't noticed how much noise he'd been carrying inside. Clattering worries, little arguments, a wind rattling loose tin. For a heartbeat, the wind stopped. Denise approached with a clipboard. We're almost to the end of the hall, she said. Room 12 is an isolation room. We leave gifts at the door and wave from the window so they can see. The little girl loves light and sound but gets overwhelmed by too much at once. I usually bring bubbles but we ran out yesterday. Tom looked down at the carts, thinking. We've got pinwheels, he said. We've got a small strand of battery lights. I could rig something. Denise smiled. That would be lovely. They stopped outside room 12. A small face peeped around the window shade, eyes wide, hair tucked under a cap. Tom crouched where she could see him plainly. He held up the pinwheel and turned it slow, letting it catch the hallway's faint moving air. He clicked the strand of lights on and wrapped them gently around the handle of a soft plush ball, then placed the bundle on the cart like a small glowing planet. Denise opened the door just enough to slide the gift inside while Tom waved, slow and friendly. The girl's eyes followed his hands. When the nurse set the lights on the tray, the girl clapped once and then put both hands over her mouth, as if she had startled herself with happiness. Tom felt a pressure behind his ribs again, but it was different from the old ache. It was a fullness that asked nothing but to be allowed. They finished the last rooms just before noon. The riders returned the empty carts to the dock. Nurses tucked extra batteries and crayons into drawers for later. In the hall outside Sophie's room, Tom found a small space by a window where the sun warmed the sill, and he sat for a minute, letting the light touch the back of his hands. He realized he was smiling without forcing it. Ruth, he thought, you were right about everything that mattered. He could see her at a church gym years ago, tying a scarf on a child, that extra careful knot she used so the kid could undo it alone later. He could see her at the kitchen table with a list, counting not the money they had but the good they could do with it. That was the ledger she kept, and it had always balanced. Tom. Denise's voice was gentle. If you've got a minute, the hospital chapel is open. Some folks find it helps. He nodded and followed the signs down a short corridor. The chapel was a small room with a wooden cross on the wall and a bowl of smooth stones on a table, each with a word written on it. Hope, courage, rest, peace. A battery candle flickered beside a guest book. He sat in the back row and let his spine touch the chair and his hands rest on his knees. He tried a prayer he had not said in a long time. Not fancy words, just the kind a tired man finds when he's done talking. Thank you, he whispered, for letting me see what I needed to see, for letting me put something down. He thought then of the phone call he had made on the storm night, the way he had backed fear with action, and called it prudence. Shame rose but it didn't bite like before. It felt more like a bruise that had stopped darkening. I did wrong by those men, he said quietly. I judged quick and wrong. I'm sorry. The room listened. That was all. It did not scold. It did not excuse. It felt like a field after rain. He chose a stone from the bowl. Rest, it said. He held it in his palm for a moment, then put it back. Not yet, he said with a small smile. But soon. When he came out, Roy was waiting in the hall with 2 paper cups of coffee and a paper bag that smelled of something sweet. Cafeteria lady likes you, Roy said. Sent an extra cinnamon roll. Tom took the cup. She must be short on judgments, he said. Roy grinned. Maybe she's long on grace. They leaned against the wall and drank their coffee like men standing on a porch watching the weather. A volunteer walked by with a small speaker and the sound of a soft carol trailed after her like a ribbon. Somewhere down the hall, a child laughed, high and quick and real. What made you do it, Tom? Roy asked after a moment. Sell the tractor, I mean. That's no small thing. Tom looked into his cup as if an answer might float up from the dark surface. I listened to a voice I'd been ignoring, he said. My wife used to say stuff is just stuff. I held on anyway. Last night I realized I was holding on to the wrong thing. What's the right thing? Roy asked. Tom lifted his eyes. People, he said. What we do for them. It's the only thing that keeps. Roy nodded, and for a second they were two men the same age. No leather, no patches, just tired faces lit from the inside by something steady. They were about to head back when Denise hurried up, a little breathless. We have a family arriving in 10 minutes, she said. New admit, long drive. The child gets overwhelmed by noise and lights. The best thing is a simple welcome, a soft blanket, maybe a toy that doesn't need instructions. Tom's mind went right to the inventory in the dock. We've got fleece throws, he said, and a box of plain wooden blocks. No bells, no whistles. Perfect, Denise said. Would you do the welcome? The parents are anxious. Tom and Roy grabbed the items and followed her to the lobby. The automatic doors opened with a whisper of cold air. A man and woman came in, carrying a small girl wrapped in a coat. The mother's face was tight with worry. The father's jaw worked as if he were chewing his fear to pieces. Denise made the introductions. Tom knelt a little, so he wasn't towering. Morning, he said. We're glad you're here. We saved you a soft spot. He spread the blanket over the nearest chair and set the blocks on the coffee table one by one, slow and calm. No rush, he said. You're not late for anything here. The girl peered out. Her eyes landed on the blocks. Tom pushed the first two together and then gently pulled them apart, so they made a quiet click. She leaned a bit toward him. He slid the second block across the table. She reached out and touched it with 2 fingers, then a whole hand, then set it down with care beside the first. The mother's eyes filled. The father exhaled, a long shaking breath. Thank you, the father said. We've been on the road since 2 a.m. She doesn't. He swallowed. She doesn't like surprises. Most of us don't, Tom said. But this is a good one. No one's going to rush you. Roy stood a little behind, arms folded, eyes soft. He looked like a guard at the gate of a quiet town, making sure nothing loud got in. When the family was settled with a nurse, Denise touched Tom's arm. That was exactly right, she said. He shrugged, a little embarrassed. Blocks are good company, he said. They don't boss you around. By early afternoon, the work shifted to stocking closets and labeling extras. Tom wrote art on one box and soft on another, and felt oddly proud of his block letters. The riders cleaned up the dock, stacked flattened cardboard, and swept stray ribbon bits into a bin. When the last receipt was taped to the log and the last toy tucked in its place, a small cheer went up. It sounded like the kind of cheer that doesn't matter to the world at large, but matters very much to the few who made it. Sophie's nurse found Tom and pressed a folded paper into his hand. She made you something, the nurse said. Tom unfolded the drawing. A green tractor with wide wings pulled a sleigh full of toys across a sky of big careful stars. Underneath, in purple crayon, "Thank you for being the best helper." For a second Tom couldn't quite breathe. He swallowed and nodded, and cleared his throat as if dust had blown in. Roy peered over his shoulder. "She gave your tractor wings," he said. "Looks right to me." Tom traced one wing with his thumb. "He always wanted to fly," he said, and found himself smiling at the silliness of the thought, and at the way it felt completely true. He slipped the drawing into his inside pocket, as if it were a deed to a new piece of land he'd just acquired. Acreage in a place you can only measure with your chest. They walked back toward Sophie's room to say goodbye. She was asleep, hush tucked under her chin, the rabbit's ear bent back in a pose of careful listening. Tom stood at the doorway, and tipped his hat even though no one could see. "Get some rest," he whispered. "We'll keep it quiet out here." In the hall Roy checked his watch. "We've got another stop across town," he said. "We can make it if we leave now." Tom nodded. "Go on then." Roy put out his hand. Tom shook it. The shake lingered. "You ever need anything," Roy said, "you call me first. We'll ride." "I might take you up on that," Tom said. "But not for me. I've got a barn that could hold a lot of hope." Roy's eyebrows lifted. "You thinkin' what I'm thinkin'?" "I'm thinking sorting," Tom said. "Labeled bins, clean floor, coffee that doesn't taste like the bottom of a boot. If you need a hub in Kansas, I've got doors that open wide." Roy smiled slow as if a picture of it was building in his mind. "We'll talk after New Year's," he said. "I like that kind of map." They walked together to the dock. Outside the air was cold but friendly. The bikes stood lined up, ready, chrome catching thin sunlight. The men and women strapped on helmets and tightened gloves. Engines turned over, one after another, a wave of sound that felt less like noise now, and more like a promise leaving. Roy swung onto his bike and looked back. "Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom," said. He meant for the barn, for the letter, for the chance to set something right. The riders pulled away, 2 by 2, the rumble fading down the street. Tom stood with his hands in his pockets, until the last tail light disappeared. Then he turned back into the warm building, the scent of cinnamon and clean mixed together like a new kind of home. He took one slow walk down the hall before leaving, not to look into rooms, just to listen. He heard chatter, the squeak of wheels, a short burst of laughter, the rustle of paper, ordinary sounds, the kind of ordinary that takes work to make. At the elevator, he pressed the button and watched the light glow. In the brushed metal of the doors, he caught his reflection. He looked like the same man, wrinkled coat, work boots, wind-stung nose, but the set of his mouth had changed. The corners turned up just a little, like hinges oiled after a long squeak. "This is what money is for," he thought. "This is what days are for." The elevator opened with a soft bell. He stepped inside, holding the pocket where Sophie's drawing rested. As the doors closed, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a choice made and held, not for glory, not for a story to tell at the cafe, but because it matched the measure he wanted to use from here on out. He had let go of something to take hold of something better. He did not need to be paid back to know the price had been right. When he reached the lobby, he thanked Denise and the volunteers, shook hands and walked out into the bright winter day. The sky was high and pale, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs in a clean way. He paused on the sidewalk, looked up, and closed his eyes for a second. The sun touched his face like a hand. "All right," he said, to nobody in particular. "Let's head home." He climbed into the truck. The cab smelled like coffee and new cardboard, and a hint of pine from the tree lot he had passed before dawn. On the passenger seat, under a stray ribbon, lay one last small box, a set of colored pencils he must have missed in the shuffle. He picked it up, and turned it over in his hands. He could bring it next time. He started the engine. As he pulled out of the lot, the hospital disappeared in the mirror behind him, but the feeling did not. It rode along, steady as the road under his tires. The fields would still be brown when he got back. The roof would still need mending on the south side. The mailbox would still offer its stack of red lines, but something had shifted that those things could not unshift. He drove west under a sky that was finally the right color for December. With one hand, he reached into his coat and touched the folded paper again. The edges were a little bent from being held too tight. He loosened his fingers and let it settle. "What we keep is what we give," he thought, and the words did not feel borrowed. They felt like his, like the kind of simple phrase a man can hand down to anyone who sits at his table. He smiled at the road, at the horizon, at the long straight line home, and kept driving. The winter sun lay low over the plains as Tom's pickup rolled home through the quiet miles of Kansas. The world looked rinsed clean, fields silvered with frost, fence posts leaning like old men resting their elbows on time. He drove with the window cracked an inch to let the cold in, the kind of clean cold that wakes you without biting. When he turned into the long lane toward his house, the barn came into view, tin roof gleaming. It looked different now, not because anything had changed, but because he had. He parked, killed the engine and sat still for a while, listening to the silence hum. Inside the barn, he ran a hand over the wooden beams still bearing the faint scuffs from that night's storm. He could almost hear the echo of engines, see shadows of riders working side by side to save what they carried. On a shelf near the door, the lone glove remained. He picked it up, and smiled. "Guess I owe you a new pair," he said softly. He hung it by a nail above the workbench, beside Ruth's old gardening shears. Then he walked to the house, made coffee and unfolded Sophie's drawing. The green tractor with wings seemed to lift off the paper itself. Beneath the purple stars, the small printed words, "Thank you for being the best helper," looked steadier than before. He framed it in an old wooden picture frame Ruth had once used for a wedding photo and set it on the mantel. "Ruth," he murmured, "looks like we've got another angel around here." In the days that followed, the phone rang more often than it had in years. Reporters called from local stations, neighbors stopped by with casseroles and questions, and folks from 3 counties over mailed Christmas cards addressed simply to the farmer who helped Santa. Tom chuckled at the attention but kept his responses short. Wasn't much to it, he'd say. Just lending a hand where one was needed. Still, he read every card. Some had shaky handwriting, some were from children, and one came from the staff at Riverside Children's Hospital, signed in a dozen colors. It said only, "The toys made it. Thank you for believing." He pinned that one above the kitchen table. A week later, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a photo, Roy and the Riders for Hope lined up outside the hospital, every one of them holding a toy. Roy had scrawled across the bottom, "For the man who reminded us what we're riding for." Tom set the photo beside the drawing. The mantel was starting to look like a small museum of kindness. January settled slow. Snow came and went. The land slept under its white blanket, and Tom worked at his own pace, fixing what needed fixing. But the barn, once just a place for tools and quiet, started to pull at his thoughts. He'd told Roy he had a place big enough for a sorting hub. Maybe he'd only half meant it then. Now the idea grew roots. On a cold morning he called the Riders' contact number. A secretary answered. "Riders for Hope Foundation," she said. "Tom Smith calling," he said. "Roy Collins might remember me. I've got an idea for next year's run." There was a pause, then a warm laugh. "Oh, he remembers, sir. Hold on." A moment later Roy's familiar voice came on the line. "Tom, I was wondering when you'd call." Tom smiled. "Figured you'd be busy saving the world." "Hardly," Roy said. "We're cleaning up after it." "What's your idea?" "Well," Tom said, "I've got a big empty barn with good walls and a solid roof, thinking it might serve better full of toys than full of dust." Roy was silent a beat. "Then you mean it?" "I mean it," Tom said. "We can make it a sorting center for next Christmas. Volunteers could help. Plenty of room for coffee too." Roy's voice softened. "You're something else, Tom. Let's make it happen." They planned through February, calling, measuring, sketching layouts. Word spread, as it does in small towns. By spring thaw, volunteers began arriving with boxes, shelves and paint. Someone donated tables from the old school cafeteria. Someone else brought string lights. The first time Tom saw it all lit up, the old barn glowing like a lantern in the twilight, he felt that same warmth he'd known in the hospital corridors. It wasn't fancy, but it was alive. When summer rolled in, the Riders thundered back into town. The sound of engines filled the air again, but this time it was welcome, familiar music. They parked along the fence line, laughing, waving, wiping dust from their jackets. Roy climbed off his bike, arms wide. "Tom Smith, you ready for a full-time job?" Tom laughed. "Didn't know I was applying." "You are now," Roy said, handing him a clipboard. "Congratulations, you're our official logistics coordinator." Tom looked down at the title printed neatly at the top. "Coordinator, huh? Fancy talk for a man with a barn." "Exactly," Roy said. "We needed one." They spent the next days sorting donations, rows of boxes labeled 0, 3 years art supplies, warm blankets and books. Neighbors stopped by to help, bringing pies and extra hands. The place smelled of coffee, sawdust and cinnamon. At the end of each day, they'd sit on the porch, watching the sun dip low, the air humming with crickets. The Riders teased Tom about his endless lists and his habit of double-checking every label. "Logistics boys," he'd say with mock sternness. "Can't spread hope if you can't find it." They laughed, and Roy would nod toward him. "Listen to the man. He knows." It was a good rhythm, steady, peaceful, meaningful. One warm June afternoon, Tom received a letter from Riverside Hospital. Inside was a note in purple crayon. "Dear Mr. Tom, Hush says hi. I'm feeling better. Thank you for helping Santa. Love, Sophie. A photograph came with it. Sophie sitting up in bed, the rabbit tucked beside her, sunlight spilling over both their faces. Tom sat down on the porch step and read the letter twice, then again slower. He wiped his eyes and smiled at the picture, until the world blurred a little around the edges. He framed it too. By July, the Riders had made the Smith farm their summer base. Children from the nearby school visited to help wrap presents, though Christmas was still months away. Tom found himself teaching them how to fold paper neatly, how to tie ribbon like Ruth used to, not too tight, easy to untie later. One boy asked, "Why do we wrap them so careful, Mr. Tom? They're just gonna rip them open." Tom smiled. That's the best part. For a second, when they tear that paper, they don't know what's inside, but they know somebody cared enough to make it special. The boy nodded solemnly. I get it. Good, Tom said. Now tie that bow again. By autumn the operation ran smooth as planting season. Boxes arrived weekly from donors across the state. Tom's barn, once silent, was alive with footsteps, laughter, the crackle of radios playing old country tunes. He even got a local bakery to donate pastries for volunteers every Saturday. On one such morning, Roy leaned against a post, sipping coffee. Tom, you realize you built yourself a whole new family here. Tom nodded toward a group of teens packing art kits. Yeah, he said softly. Didn't see that coming. You happy? Roy asked. Tom thought for a moment. The answer came easy. I'm steady, he said. That's better than happy. Steady stays. When winter returned, the Riders prepared for their next big run. Trucks were packed, routes mapped. The night before departure, they gathered in the barn for chili and stories. The walls glowed with strings of white lights, the air thick with the smell of spice and laughter. Roy raised a mug. To Tom Smith, he said, voice loud enough to fill the rafters. The man who showed us that kindness don't need a throttle. It just needs a start. Tom blushed under the applause. Now don't get carried away, he said. I just lent you a barn. Yeah, Roy said, grinning. And maybe a little heart to go with it. The Riders clapped again, and Tom lifted his own cup. To the road ahead, he said. May it be long enough for all the good we've got left to do. They cheered, and someone started a tune on an old harmonica. The sound was rough but sweet, rising into the beams. For a moment, Tom closed his eyes. He could almost feel Ruth beside him, swaying to the music, smiling that quiet smile she used to wear when the world seemed right. Christmas morning came cold and bright. Frost sparkled on the barn roof like sugar. The Riders lined up, engines rumbling low, breath turning white in the air. Tom handed Roy a thermos. For the road, Roy grinned. You sure you don't want to come with us this time? Someone's gotta keep the coffee hot, for when you get back, Tom said. Roy laughed, saluted and revved his engine. The line of bikes began to roll out, tires crunching on the gravel. Tom stood by the gate, watching them go until the last one disappeared down the county road. The sound lingered, soft and steady, like a heartbeat fading into the distance. He turned back toward the barn. The morning light poured through the open doors, catching on the ribbons and leftover wrapping paper scattered on the floor. He bent to pick one up, a strip of purple, the same color as Sophie's crayon, and tied it to the barn latch. Keep you lucky, he said. Then he walked to the porch, sat on the swing, and poured himself a cup of coffee. The steam rose in gentle curls. Across the yard, the wind stirred the frost into tiny whirlwinds that danced a moment and vanished. On the wall beside the door, hung Sophie's drawing, the photo from the hospital, and the Riders' group picture. The green tractor with wings seemed to shine brightest of all. He rocked slowly, the creak of the chain matching the rhythm of his breathing. The house was still, but not empty. Somewhere in that stillness, lived every voice he'd met on the road to kindness. Ruth's laughter, Sophie's whisper, Roy's deep chuckle. He looked out over the fields, where new snow softened every line and fence post. The land rested easy, ready for another year. Tom smiled, the kind that starts deep in the chest and takes its time reaching the face. He lifted his mug slightly, as if in a silent toast. "Here's to you, Ruth," he said, "and to anyone trying to make a little light out of the cold." The wind stirred again, moving through the cottonwoods with a soft, answering sound, half sigh, half song. Tom leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the winter sun warm his hands. The world felt wide, but not lonely. For the first time in a long while, he was at peace.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.